Okay, let's unpack this. Can Solana actually reach a new all-time high this cycle?
Yeah.
You think back to the excitement, right? When it briefly blew past $300, then that sharp dip falling below $100, all the craziness around meme coins, projects just, well, vanishing. For a lot of traders watching that, it felt like maybe the Solana party was, kind of wrapping up early, like before the real altcoin run even kicked off.
Yeah, that reaction is totally understandable. I mean, looking at just the dollar price charts, they tell a very dramatic story.
Well, not the whole story.
Exactly. They rarely tell the whole story, especially in crypto. If you want to understand Solana's real potential from here, you got to look deeper.
And that's exactly what we're doing in this deep dive. We're getting into a specific source, a pretty detailed YouTube analysis from someone called Virtual Bacon. He's apparently been in crypto for 6 years, looked at over 100 startups, shares his thoughts on market trends, investing strategy, that sort of thing.
Right. And the core question his analysis really tackles, the big one sort of hanging over Solana right now, is whether that recent peak, around $250, was that just a classic double top pattern playing out in its second cycle?
Yeah, can it actually break back above that old high of $250 and push into new territory?
Because, and this is what the analysis really hammers home, just looking at the USD price. It just doesn't give you the crucial context.
Okay.
Exactly. So when we look at Solana's bounce from that December 2022 bottom, yeah, sure, it had that huge 29x run. It even briefly passed its old dollar high.
Right.
But this view points out that the peak earlier this year, around when the source says Trump's inauguration day happened, that was followed by a break below its 2-year uptrend line.
Oh.
And it made a new lower low, slipping below $100.
Okay, so here's where this analysis says it gets, really interesting.
Yeah.
And important for you listening to grasp. A huge focus is put on the SOL-BTC ratio chart. Why track performance against Bitcoin specifically? What's the deal there?
Oh, it's absolutely critical. Bitcoin is, well, it's the benchmark for the whole crypto market, right?
Right.
So for any altcoin to survive, really thrive over multiple market cycles, it needs to at least hold its value relative to Bitcoin, ideally gain ground.
Okay.
So tracking that SOL-BTC ratio, that shows Solana's true strength, its strength against the market leader, not just against, the dollar's ups and downs.
Okay, so looking at that SOL-BTC chart, according to this analysis, the picture initially seems a bit concerning. Solana hasn't actually made a new high against Bitcoin's value in 2023 or 2024.
Yes, exactly. Despite that amazing comeback in USD terms, $10 to $250, the source explicitly calls its performance against Bitcoin about average.
Average, really, after that run.
Yep. Just a typical bounce from a bear market low when you compare it to how a lot of other altcoin versus Bitcoin pairs acted in a similar phase.
And the analysis uses Fibonacci levels, right, on the SOL-BTC chart to show this from the 2021 peak down to the 2022 low.
That's right. And Solana bounced right up to the 0.618 Fibonacci retracement level and stopped there.
And that 0.618 level, that's important in this analysis. Why?
Because it's described as very typical behavior, just what most altcoins do on their second market cycle bounce. The source even shows a similar pattern happened with the overall altcoin market cap against Bitcoin in the last cycle, 2021 versus 2017.
So the dollar gain felt huge, but compared to Bitcoin,
Yeah,
kind of standard for a second cycle bounce.
pretty much. Not outstanding in relative terms.
And this analysis notes that right now that SOL-BTC ratio is actually dropping again.
It is, which leads us straight into a really key comparison that this analysis makes, and it cites Benjamin Cowan's work here.
Okay.
It highlights a very similar pattern between Solana's current SOL-BTC chart and how Ethereum performed against Bitcoin, the ETH-BTC chart, back in 2021.
Okay. Comparing Solana now to Ethereum during the last bull run. Interesting. What did that look like for ETH?
Well, Ethereum was an early runner in the last cycle, much like Solana was recently. It peaked against Bitcoin at a key resistance level around the 0.5 fib.
Yeah.
Then it took a major dip, bounced back up. But here's the crucial part. Ethereum never made a new high on that ETH-BTC pair after that first big run.
And it ended up.
It eventually just kept bleeding against Bitcoin in valuation all through 2021 and 2022. And this analysis sees a very similar pattern potentially unfolding on the SOL-BTC chart right now.
Okay, wow. So what does this mean for you if you're watching Solana? This view seems to have both good news and, well, bad news based on that comparison.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The good news, according to this analysis, is that Solana will most likely come back up, probably in the second phase of this bull run.
When things pick up generally.
Exactly. When global liquidity conditions improve, the broader altcoin run gets going. And crucially, this upward move by itself could be enough to push Solana to a new all-time high in its dollar value.
Okay, a new dollar high sounds great. I mean, who wouldn't want that? But the bad news, that's about the relative strength again, isn't it?
Precisely. According to this perspective, that expected bounce, even if it happens, won't automatically make Solana a standout performer compared to other altcoins.
Right.
If it rallies up, maybe retests a fib level against Bitcoin, but makes a lower high on that BTC pair chart, and then starts to decline relative to Bitcoin again. Well, this analysis would see that as a terrible sign for its long-term strength, for its strength beyond just this cycle.
Because that would basically just copy Ethereum's pattern from 2021, 2022. It would signal it lacks that vital relative strength against Bitcoin, the market leader.
Exactly.
So the critical question this analysis really raises is, can Solana actually defy that pattern? Can it come back up, keep running, make a new high on his Bitcoin pair?
Yeah.
Or is it kind of destined to make a lower high against Bitcoin and follow that Ethereum path?
Now, shifting gears just a bit. This analysis does acknowledge the negative vibes, after the meme coin stuff cooled off. The source mentions things like Melania and the Argentina coin Rugged.
Yeah, that wasn't great.
No. But it stresses that you must not discount the unique position Solana has right now.
Okay, this is important for your sort of fundamental understanding of Solana, right? Even if you don't care about meme coins, this view argues you have to see Solana as the only viable competitor to Ethereum when it comes to smart contracts, at least among the current big blockchains.
And the key reason given is its virtual machine, its tech stack. This analysis states it's the only other blockchain stack actively developed and used daily for trading on a really significant scale.
And the source backs this up.
Yeah, it points to Solana's rankings in things like DeFi TVL, average wallet accounts, number of transactions, total dApp volume, and contrast that with Ethereum's EVM, which is kind of fragmented across lots of different chains,
Right.
and other potential competitors, like Sui or Aptos with their MoveVM. This analysis just dismisses them as simply uncomparable right now. Not enough users, developers, stability, you name it.
So the really big picture question this analysis throws out there is, can Solana actually challenge Ethereum? Maybe even replace it as the king of smart contracts. This view says it's definitely a possibility. And it notes the source creator holds both ETH and SOL, for what that's worth.
Yeah, but the analysis is also really clear about where Solana still lags behind. Okay, it's become the go-to for retail traders, mobile apps, high-frequency stuff.
Yeah.
But it's still lagging behind when it comes to institutional interests in RWAs, real-world assets, compared to Ethereum.
And there's a point about scalability, too. Right?
Yeah, this view is not convinced that Solana's core technical advantage, its speed and scalability, is really enough on its own anymore. It argues that scalability is no longer the killer feature it might have been a few years ago for blockchain tech. That alone might not be enough to drive the SOL coin itself to its, full potential.
And this leads to a pretty sobering warning from history that the analysis highlights.
Yeah, it brings up the relic layer ones from past cycles, names you might remember like Neo, EOS, Polkadot, Tezos.
Oh yeah, remember those.
This source notes they lasted at most 2 cycles, and then eventually they all faded into irrelevance. All their gains against Bitcoin just gone.
Ouch. And the question this analysis kind of whispers is Solana heading for that same scenario?
Right. And for Solana to avoid that fate, to become something more than just a trade, something you hold long-term like Bitcoin or Ethereum, this view points to 2 absolutely crucial things it needs. Significant institutional adoption and proving it has long-term resilience against the rest of the market.
Meaning specifically,
it needs stable performance against Bitcoin over at least 2 cycles, and it needs institutional recognition as a digital commodity.
Okay, and on that institutional front, this analysis actually highlights huge progress this year.
It does. A key example is the CME Group launching Solana Futures back on March 17th. That's seen as a big deal, a coveted position on a regulated U.S. exchange. Something only Bitcoin and Ethereum futures had since 2021.
That is significant.
Yeah. The source also mentions XRP futures are coming, but, that's another story for another deep dive.
And also, importantly, this view points out that the SEC has also withdrawn their previous lawsuit against Solana, the one that classified it as a security. And the implication drawn from the source is that this likely means Solana will get a regulatory nod, that it's not to be a security in the SEC's eyes.
And this regulatory clarity, according to the analysis, makes U.S. spot ETFs the natural next step.
Ah, the ETFs.
Yep. The source mentions the first spot Solana ETF in North America actually launched just last week up in Canada.
And in the U.S.?
Well, back in March, Fidelity, third largest asset manager globally, they filed for a U.S. spot Solana ETF.
Okay, Fidelity's big, but this analysis wonders if maybe that's enough, or if BlackRock needs to jump in too.
Yeah, the source does look at BlackRock, the biggest asset manager. Now, their on-chain build fund has integrated trading on Solana, which is interesting.
Right.
But an interview from February, cited in the analysis, shows them still kind of basically considering it, but they have a lot of questions, right? About the investment thesis, suitability, liquidity. They don't want to promise anything yet.
Okay, so maybe not a done deal with BlackRock yet, but things are moving. The source gives that deadline of October 10th for the SEC's final decision on the current U.S. spot Solana ETF filings.
And notes Bloomberg analysts are giving it a 90% approval chance. That's definitely a key date for you to watch.
Definitely. Okay, let's circle back to how Solana is doing against other altcoins, because that's critical for its long-term survival, according to this view.
Absolutely. The source shows a chart comparing Solana's market cap to the total 3 market cap that's basically all other altcoins minus stablecoins.
Yeah.
It peaked back in November 2024, described as a pivot point in sentiment, a time when people were no longer making huge amounts of money on Solana by trading meme coins.
Right, the frenzy cooled. So the early excitement back in the 2022-2023, that was driven by Solana being relatively cheap compared to its potential value then.
Exactly. Now, being a top 10 asset, this analysis sees it more as fairly valued.
Okay.
And the core challenge for its survival, staying in the type 5 beyond this cycle, is that it clearly needs to make a new high on its SOU-BTC ratio. It can't just coast on dollar pumps or being an early runner anymore.
It needs to prove its strength.
Yeah. Its strength must be measured against Bitcoin's ratio and against all other altcoins. We need to see if it can actually regain that uptrend during what this source calls the real altcoin bull run.
Which is expected when?
Over the next 12 to 18 months, roughly. Expected when global liquidity improves and Bitcoin dominance drops off a bit.
And this analysis expects Solana will get a second win then.
Right.
It'll come back up against Bitcoin during that phase.
Yeah, that's the expectation. It'll likely revisit its previous valuations against Bitcoin, but, and this echoes that Ethereum comparison again, the real make-or-break moment is what happens after that bounce.
Does the SOL-BTC ratio just stall out and drop again?
Or can it actually push through to new highs and break that pattern? That's the million-dollar question, so to speak.
Okay, so using these two different scenarios for the SOL-BTC ratio and combining that with the expectation for Bitcoin's peak this cycle.
Which the source thinks could hit $200,000 to $250,000.
Right, so using those, this analysis calculates some potential price targets for Solana.
Exactly.
Okay, so scenario 1, Solana just bounces back. Hits that 0.5 Fibonacci level on the SOBTC chart, somewhere between a 0.00022 and 0.00024 ratio. What does that mean in dollars based on that Bitcoin prediction?
Okay, so doing the math, it gives you a USD range of about $440 on the low end, 200K Bitcoin times 0.0002 up to about $600 on the high end, 250K Bitcoin times 0.0024.
So $440 to $600, that's the range this source finds quite likely to happen.
Yeah, seems like the base case expectation in this analysis.
But hitting $600, while nice, isn't enough for that long-term conviction in this view, is it? What about the scenario where Solana actually outperforms Bitcoin significantly?
Right. For that to happen, this analysis says Solana needs to get at least above 0.00031 on the SOU-LBTC ratio that was the peak back in March 2024. And ideally, it needs to hit 0.00033 and maintain there on a weekly time frame.
Okay, 0.0033 and holding. That would print a new higher high, confirm a strong uptrend versus Bitcoin.
Exactly. That's the signal they're looking for.
And what's a dollar target if it does reach that 0.00003 ratio, assuming Bitcoin hits that $200K to $250K range?
Okay, so 200K Bitcoin times 0.00033 gives you 600,00033, gives you $825.
$660 to $825.
Yeah. The source says they want to see Solana get above $700 and ideally over $800. That level, that sustained outperformance against Bitcoin, is what would put Solana in its own category.
An altcoin truly beating Bitcoin over 2 cycles.
Right. And that would convince the source creator to potentially hold it for more cycles to come over a much longer term.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's talk timing. Crucial question. Based on this analysis, it's now seen as a good time to buy, a buying opportunity.
Yes, actually. The source explicitly states that right now is a good time to be getting into Solana, and they cite those bullish catalysts expected later this year.
Right, the catalyst being the U.S. spot ETFs with that October 10th SEC deadline and the high approval odds.
and the expectation that quantitative tightening, QT, will pause sometime this year, which should lead to improved global liquidity, especially by Q4. The source even mentions potential stealth QE and talks about a Fed trigger for the next altcoin run.
Okay, so both those big potential drivers are timed for Q4 this year.
Pretty much. However, the source does add a note of caution about Q3, mentions potential liquidity drains from things like the U.S. debt ceiling expiry, Treasury refueling its account, stuff like that.
So maybe don't expect an immediate moonshot tomorrow, but possibly more chop between that $100 to $150 range.
Exactly. Which this analysis views as a good buying opportunity if you believe in the longer-term story.
And speaking of longer term, what about the timing for the potential cycle top? Has that view changed?
It has, according to the source, they are shifting my targets to mid-2026, saying they're no longer forcing myself to exit my Solana position this year.
Mid-2026, why the shift?
It's based on expecting a longer cycle overall for the whole market. Maybe the altcoin cycle lasts well into 2026, potentially Q3, driven by these liquidity factors and the feeling that the Fed just keeps delaying their pivot.
Okay, so pulling the strategy from this source together quickly, buying in this $100 150 zone now looks favorable. Expecting a new dollar high, maybe around $500 plus, over the next year seems likely just from a bounce back against BTC as Bitcoin potentially climbs towards 200K.
Yep, that's the baseline. But the real conviction, the signal that Solana is a true long-term multi-cycle hold, that only comes if it breaks above $700, ideally pushes over $800. That confirms the crucial outperformance versus Bitcoin over 2 cycles.
Got it. And just for context on the source creator's own stance, I mentioned holding a large position, like 30% of their public portfolio. Held for 12 months, added more in March, around $128.
Right. And they plan to add more when the Fed pauses QT and global liquidity picks up again. So it's clear this analysis gives you a very specific framework for looking at Solana, heavily focused on its performance against Bitcoin and those broader macro liquidity conditions, not just chasing the dollar price day to day.
Okay, so let's wrap up our deep dive into this virtual bacon analysis. We've seen Solana's recent journey, that big run-up, but also the critical importance, according to this view, of measuring its strength against Bitcoin using that SOA-BTC ratio.
We explored that comparison the source makes to Ethereum's pattern in the last cycle, which suggests, yeah, BEMS is likely, but it also highlights the risk of a lower high on the BTC pair. That would be a concerning sign for its relative strength long-term.
We talked about Solana's unique position, maybe the only real Ethereum competitor among the big chains because of its VM stack, but also acknowledging the hurdles like lagging institutional interest and the argument that just being scalable isn't the sole killer feature anymore.
Right, which led us to that historical warning about altcoins just fading away after 2 cycles. And the absolute need, in this view, for Solana to get that institutional stamp of approval and prove its long-term strength against Bitcoin if it wants to break that historical pattern.
We covered the big institutional progress points cited this year, CME futures, the potential SEC lawsuit withdrawal implication, the move towards spot ETFs with Fidelity filing, BlackRock considering it, and that really key October 10th SEC deadline with those high predicted approval odds.
And finally, we laid out those potential price targets derived from this specific analysis. $440 to $600 seen as quite likely just based on a bounce back against Bitcoin. But that $700 to $800 plus range is the threshold needed for this source to really see Solana as a true multi-cycle outperformer.
Plus the timing aspect, the window for a buying opportunity seen as now in that $100 $150 range, driven by catalysts expected later this year, but with a potential cycle top possibly extending out into mid-2026.
Yeah, quite a detailed picture.
So, why does all this analysis matter to you listening? Well, understanding this specific viewpoint, this framework, helps you look beyond just the daily price swings. It helps you focus on the signals this source believes are genuinely important for Solana's future. Its performance against Bitcoin, the progress on institutional adoption, the impact of macro liquidity, and those historical patterns of altcoin cycles.
Right. It provides a way, according to this one analysis at least, to potentially identify buying ranges, think about timing the market cycle, and hopefully cut through some of the noise to focus on what might actually drive things long term.
So a final thought to leave you with, building on that theme from the source about historical relic layer ones and the challenge for Solana to break that so-called altcoin curse by making a new high against Bitcoin.
Does the recent surge in institutional interest, the CME futures, the ETF filings, combined with its unique actively used VM stack, Does that genuinely give Solana enough fundamental strength, enough resilience to actually defy that historical trend? The trend of altcoins eventually fading after maybe 2 good cycles.
Or is the market's constant search for the next big thing, the next shiny layer one, just an unavoidable force? Is it something that Solana, despite its current strengths, might eventually fall victim to anyway?
Definitely something to think about as you continue forming your own perspective on Solana's future.